This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. South Korea's ruling party considers pushing Yoon Suk to resign by February, with a possible election soon after. Taiwan reports China's biggest naval deployment in nearly 30 years, following President William Lai's short visit to the U.S. And Chinese President Xi Jinping warns of no winners in a trade war with America, as he expresses confidence in the country's economic growth prospects. Ahead on East Asia tonight, the recent suicide of popular Chinese romance novelist Qiong Yao prompts reflection in Taiwan on the vulnerabilities linked to its elderly. We examine this silent crisis. South Korea's ruling People Power Party says it is discussing the idea of President Yoon Suk resigning as soon as February. Well, the nation would then hold an election in April or May, and it's all tied to the turmoil caused by Mr. Yoon's short-lived martial law decree, which came 1 week ago tonight. Now, this development follows a key vote in the National Assembly. Lawmakers overwhelmingly passed a bill to have a permanent special counsel probe insurrection charges against the president. The motion calls for an investigation into Mr. Yoon, as well as other officials involved in the martial law declaration. And they include former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun and the Army Chief of Staff, General Park An-soon. Lim Yun Suk joins us live now from Seoul. Yun Suk, I'm curious to know what's been the reaction to the timeline set by the ruling party for President Yoon's exit, as well as the snap polls.
Well, there's no reaction yet, but right now it does seem like that is the plan of the ruling party. After studying ways to try and bring stability to this country, it seems like the party now has two drafts, and one is the resignation in February and a snap election in April, or let him stay on until March and then the presidential election in May. Now, we're not sure if the ruling party had even discussed this with President Yoon or if he is going to be following these steps. But, it is very likely that the main opposition parties and the other smaller parties too are not going to accept this, and in fact they are going to go ahead and try to impeach President Yoon this Saturday. Because what they're saying is that the only road for him is really to resign or to be investigated. Now, we will have to see, what the opposition party says, but it's also important that the assembly passed that motion calling for the special counsel to investigate the insurrection charges and the abuse of power by President Yoon Suk. Now, this motion passed with 210 votes in favor and 63 votes against, as the ruling party before that vote took place said that its 108 members would have the freedom to vote which way they wanted to, as they didn't think that, that this motion was something that they could protest. And so now that it has passed, he will need to appoint a special counsel to investigate the charges of insurrection and this abuse of power against President Yoon. And that would end the ongoing separate investigations that we have now by the prosecution, the police, and the Corruption Investigation Office for high-ranking officials. Now, they would have to hand in all the evidence that they have to the special counsel. And as you said, apart from President Yoon, there are other people included, including the former defense minister, but also included in that is the current Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, the ruling party representative Choo Kyung-ho, who recently stepped down from his position as the party's floor leader. Now, they all are also being accused of either committing insurrection themselves or colluding in this act of insurrection. Now, according to some of the legal experts here, what can happen now is that the 7-member committee of the legal experts must name 2 candidates, and it is the president who holds the power to confirm and appoint the special counsel within 3 days after the committee picks the 2 candidates. But, whether President Yoon Suk is going to do that or what happens if he doesn't do that are really just questions. And it seems like there's no answer because everything right now that we're hearing and we're seeing in the news the last few days are really unprecedented events here in South Korea. So we'll have to wait to see what happens in the coming days.
Right, and there's also this new government budget that's just been approved by the opposition-controlled parliament. Yun Suk, can you tell us more about that?
Well, yes, this is the parliament passing this government budget bill earlier this evening. And, even before the declaration of the martial law, the opposition parties, which control the parliament, had said they would pass this reduced budget bill. And in a way, that was one of the reasons why President Yoon Suk said that he had to declare this martial law last week. Now, the budget for 2025 is now set at 677.4 trillion won, which is about 473 billion US dollars. And that's a cut of about 4.1 trillion won, about 2.8 billion US dollars from what the South Korean government had earlier proposed. Now, this is the first time, unprecedented again, where the budget plan was revised just by the lawmakers of the opposition party alone, without the consent of the government or the ruling party members. Now, included in the cut is millions of dollars for the National Security Office, the State Audit Agency, the prosecution, and the police, the special activity expenses of the President's office, Secretariat, and also included is some of the plans that President Yoon had regarding the nuclear plant energy projects, including those overseas. Now, the opposition party members say that those cuts are needed to help the president keep in check, but many conservatives here in South Korea also see this as the opposition's way of trying to push back against possibly the prosecution of its leader, Lee Jae-myung, who is facing several charges. When President Yoon Suk declared the martial law, vowing to eliminate anti-state forces, in a way, experts were saying that he was referring to the opposition party members and their plans to slash this budget. Now, the finance minister, Choi Sang-mok, had earlier called for a bipartisan agreement on the budget bill, saying that it was necessary to maintain external credibility and ensure economic stability. And so, we'll have to see how the market is going to react to this budget cut. But the main opposition Democratic Party has also left open the possibility of allocating supplementary spending when state affairs return to normal. And to them, it probably means after President Yoon Suk is impeached and South Korea gets a new leader.
Still lots up in the air. Well, thanks so very much for that report, Lim Yun Suk in Seoul. Now, Henry Haggard at West Advisors tells us how the domestic situation in South Korea could become a cause for international concern.
I think what's important is to look at how United States and other international actors are seeing what's going on. If you have a president that can't travel, if you have generals that are saying they're not going to listen to the president's orders, if you have a prime minister who's saying they're going to create some new ruling structure, that is really, it's hard to partner with a country in that situation. And this is getting a domestic situation is becoming an issue for international concern. I think on the day-to-day, probably the machine of Korea Inc., both the conglomerates, the chaebol, as well as the excellent folks in the ministries, they will make the government work, I think, probably for quite some time. And I think probably people would say, hey, look, just sit back, let us conduct our political theater. We'll come to a conclusion that will make sense. Domestically, that makes 100% sense. Internationally, it just doesn't. That's not how, international allies and partners work with Korea. And most importantly, in a time of crisis, how is Korea stepping up to have a voice in the ongoing and the evolving situation in Syria? Is Korea focusing on how it can be more present in dealing with President-elect Trump? Or is it focused only on its domestic interests?
And for more insights into the rallies that are taking place across South Korea, we will be speaking with CNA's Grace Shin a little later this hour on East Asia Tonight. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has reiterated that issues concerning Taiwan are China's internal affairs and that it will firmly safeguard its national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, this was in response to a question posed on Beijing's large-scale naval deployment in waters around Taiwan. Well, Taiwan's been saying that the number of vessels involved was China's largest in nearly 3 decades and called it an alarming surge in Chinese military activity following the return of its president from a Pacific tour.
动用了这么大规模的兵力，在这样大的区域范围来做这样子的这个训练，我想值得我们关注的不仅仅是回头我刚刚讲的，由言转训，由训转演，由言转战，而是这样的情况之下，对周遭国家可能带来的这个影响，那还有可能造成的冲击。
Taiwanese officials told various media that around 90 naval and coast guard ships have been detected along the so-called First Island chain, which links Japan's Okinawa, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Well, Taiwan says that China's deployment of ships in the waters is bigger than its military drills back in 2022, which were the most extensive Chinese military activity in the region at the time. Well, that was in response to then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei. Well, Taiwan raised its alert level yesterday following reports that China set up 7 so-called air reserve zones and deployed several of its own vessels in response. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. says that his country will continue its resupply missions in the South China Sea, despite a recent incident with Chinese vessels. Mr. Marcos says that Manila will never be a part of an escalation in the West Philippine Sea, referring to the portion of the South China Sea that his country claims. The president also says he will not deploy the country's navy to the area to prevent provocation and escalation. In response, Beijing says it will continue to safeguard its sovereignty, rights and interests, pinning the blame for recent maritime incidents in disputed waters on what it calls Manila's persistent infringement and provocation. Philippine officials said last week that Chinese Coast Guard vessels fired a water cannon and sideswiped a Manila Fisheries Bureau boat. The vessel was transporting supplies to Filipino fishermen operating the Scarborough Shoal, a prime fishing patch. Philippine Coast Guard vessels also allegedly faced blocking, shadowing, and dangerous maneuvers from a Chinese Navy vessel. China says that it will impose visa restrictions on U.S. officials who have, quote, behaved poorly on Hong Kong. It's unclear which officials are affected, but this follows Washington's earlier threat to sanction multiple Hong Kong officials who are behind the implementation of the city's national security law. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Mao Ning, said that Beijing had decided on the move as the U.S. had interfered in China's internal affairs by using such issues to indiscriminately impose visa curbs on its officials. Now, she's also urged the U.S. to respect China's sovereignty and Hong Kong's legal system. A Washington sanction threat came after the city sentenced 45 activists to jail last month for their roles in an unauthorized election in 2020. They were given terms of between 4 years and 2 months to 10 years. Japan says that its self-defense force has suspended operations of some of its Osprey aircraft to ensure safety. Well, that decision comes after the U.S. earlier paused flights of America's own V-22 Osprey fleet, following investigations that revealed weakened metal components that may have played a role in a recent near crash. Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi says that the Japanese Defense Ministry is actively confirming details with the U.S., while emphasizing that safety remains the highest priority. Ospreys are a class of military aircraft manufactured by the United States that have faced criticism over their safety record, with several high-profile incidents. Well, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, latest trade data out of China add to deepening concerns of sluggish demand in the world's second largest economy. Plus, South Korean markets rebound, but authorities warn that recent volatility is excessive. Hello again. We are back from the break, and it is now time for business with Roland. And Roland, the Chinese president basically striking a positive note on the country's growth prospects and also weighing in on trade tensions with the U.S. So what did he say?
Yes, Oteli. President Xi Jinping confident the country hitting its growth goals for the year. During a meeting with the heads of major international economic organizations in Beijing, President Xi reiterated his belief, saying that China would continue to play its role as the biggest engine of world economic growth. Now, Beijing is targeting annual growth this year of around 5%, despite sluggish domestic consumption, high unemployment, and a prolonged crisis in the vast property sector. President Xi's comments comes a day after the country's leaders pledged to implement moderately loose monetary policy to revive economic growth. The Chinese president also warned that a trade war with the United States would result in no winners. He expressed China's willingness to maintain dialogue with the U.S. government, quote, to expand cooperation, manage differences, and promote the development of U.S.-China relations. Now, the comments appeared in state media ahead of next month's inauguration of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. They also come on the heels of China's probe into Nvidia. Yesterday, Beijing fired its latest salvo in the U.S.-China semiconductor wars by announcing an antitrust probe into the American chip giant. The probe is widely seen as a retaliatory measure against Washington's latest curbs on the Chinese chip sector. Chips have become a crux in the competition because of how critical they are to AI, cyber warfare, military equipment, and other areas with national security and economic significance. Meantime, Nvidia's revenue from China totaled more than $13 billion in the past 4 quarters. Now, that accounts for about 12% of sales. Now, FactSet data shows that Nvidia gets as much as 16% of its revenue from China, second only to what it gets from U.S. customers. Now, that number has recently shrunk as U.S. export curbs restricted Nvidia's ability to sell advanced chips to China. Its shares ended the session lower by about 2.6% and are trailing in after-hours trade. Key suppliers Advantest and SK Hynix recovered from earlier losses, both ending in the green. Taiwan's semiconductor giant TSMC closing with losses despite posting a 34% sales growth in November. China's exports slowed sharply and imports unexpectedly shrank in November, a worrying sign in the face of heightened trade risks owing to Donald Trump's imminent return to the White House. Exports grew by 6.7% on year to just over $312 billion. Now, that's significantly lower than more than the 12% rise the country recorded the month before. Of more concern for authorities, imports shrank 3.9%, their worst performance in 9 months, at dashing expectations of a 0.3% increase. Now, both metrics missing analyst forecasts in US dollar terms. The disappointing trade figures follow other indicators showing patchy growth in the month of November, suggesting Beijing needs to do more to shore up a faltering economy that is only likely to face further challenges next year. Experts say U.S. tariffs pose a bigger threat to China than they did during Trump's first term. Now, that's as the $19 trillion export economy is one of the main growth drivers, with household and business confidence dented by a prolonged property crisis. Government advisors have recommended Beijing keep its growth target unchanged at around 5% next year and implements more forceful stimulus to mitigate the expected U.S. tariffs by leaning on the country's vast domestic consumption sector. Our top policymakers are expected to meet this week to set key targets and policy intentions for next year. Hong Kong and Chinese stocks jumped today on fresh stimulus pledges before Hong Kong ran out of steam. The blue chip CSI 300 rallied 3.3%, its highest in nearly a month, before paring off some of those gains. The Shanghai Composite also putting on more than 2% in early trade before profit-taking set in. Now, in Hong Kong, the benchmark Hang Seng Index ended in the red after November trade data in China was weaker than expected. Heavyweights Tencent, Alibaba fell, leading to the Hang Seng Tech Index losing some 1.4%, while property developers like Longfor Group and China Overseas Land also headed south. U.S. and Taiwan are marking a significant milestone in economic ties as both sides hail the official start to their first trade agreement. Signed in 2023, the U.S.-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade represents Taipei's hopes to ramp up talks with Washington that could facilitate the inking of a free trade deal. The first agreement covers areas including anti-corruption, customs administration, and trade facilitation, as well as small and medium-sized enterprises. Ongoing talks for a second agreement would cover areas like labor, the environment, and agriculture. Taiwan's Office of Trade Negotiation says that the agreement showed that rock-solid partnership between two trading partners. Now, the agreement came shortly after Taiwan was excluded from the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in May of 2022. It followed the Biden administration's attempt to counter what it deemed was China's growing economic and military coercion in the region. Now, Washington does not recognize Taipei diplomatically, but maintains close unofficial ties. Efforts to strengthen trade ties have drawn anger from China, which has consistently rejected Taiwan's claims to sovereignty. Korean shares rebounded from a 13-month low as authorities vowed to take measures to stabilize the markets. Financial authorities said that volatility was a little excessive in the financial markets recently and that they would respond actively with stabilizing measures. The opposition party has also passed a government budget bill that in part triggered President Yoon's martial law decree last week. The benchmark Kospi index closing up by 2.4%, its biggest one-day percentage gain since September 26. The Korean won also rose against the dollar, and the benchmark bond yield, its most liquid, that's the 3-year Treasury yield, that fell by 5.5 basis points to 2.521%. Chinese cosmetics maker Mao Geping made a blistering trading debut in Hong Kong. Its $300 million offering underscoring appetite for fresh listings in the Asian financial hub. Now, it sold some 78.4 million shares at $3.83 US apiece. Its share tranche for retail investors were nearly 920 times oversubscribed, while a portion of institutional investors was 30 times oversubscribed. The Hangzhou-based company, which manufactures makeup, sells its products at retail outlets across China, as well as online platforms like Alibaba's Tmall and Taobao platforms. Shares of the cosmetic seller soared as much as 87% in early trade before closing up nearly 77% at $6.82 US. Sony shares hitting a record closing high driven by growing hopes of its games segment and other entertainment businesses. The shares ended 4.1% higher, surpassing the previous record marked up 24 years ago. The stocks have been rising sharply in recent weeks after the Japanese entertainment electronics giant announced second quarter results that smashed analyst expectations. Last month, Sony reported a 69% jump in quarterly net profit to $2.24 billion, driven by the strength of its game business. A shift to digital game purchases and the PlayStation Plus subscription service has boosted its gaming division. The company has also been investing billions of dollars in acquisitions to boost entertainment content creation. And that's the latest in business.
Thanks so much, Roland. Well, time now for another break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, we'll have CNA's Grace Shin joining us to share a little bit more about how South Korean youths are taking on political crisis in the country. And we turn to the growing political uncertainty in Syria following the downfall of the Assad regime, with the US and China among nations voicing their concerns. You're watching East Asia tonight. Taiwan reports China's biggest naval deployment in nearly 30 years following President William Lai's short visit to the US. Beijing responds by reiterating that issues related to the island are China's internal affairs. Meantime, Chinese President Xi Jinping warns there are no winners in a trade war with America as he expresses confidence about the country's economic growth prospects. And South Korea's ruling party considers pushing Yoon Suk to resign by February, with a possible election to come soon after. A special counsel, meantime, has been approved to investigate the president and other senior officials over the short-lived martial law decree. Now, thousands have been rallying across the country demanding President Yoon Suk-yeol's removal from office. And for more, we have Grace Shin joining us in the studio. So, Grace, a lot of people are expecting a mass rally in Seoul this Saturday. What can we expect?
Well, as you said, Otelli, it's a very big rally. It's going to be a very big rally because it's on that day that an impeachment motion will be voted for the second time. But leading up to, we've already been seeing thousands hit the streets of Seoul or around the nation, protesting mostly against President Yoon and asking him to come down. Now, it's not a surprise because during these politically turmoil events, we've seen many go out to the streets demanding that. Usually we see the most crowds at downtown Seoul, namely near the presidential office, the National Assembly, and Gwanghwamun Square. And if you recall, back in 2016, a lot of foreign media highlighted how demonstrations in Korea seem to be constituted for candlelights because out on the streets, nighttime, you could see candlelights light up. So this time around, we will be expecting that too. But before we go on, I want to share a few interviews that I had with people at Seoul at the moment right now and what their anticipations are for the coming days.
I'm a father of one daughter and just an ordinary guy in Korea. I attended elementary school located between Yonsei University and Ewha Women's University in the early 1980s. During my commute, to and from school, I witnessed as college student chanting for democracy and the process of suppressing these demonstrations from my young age. Therefore, I deeply understand the great sacrifices made and the value of living in a truly democratic society where we can freely criticize the president without fear of arrest.
What happened in America during BLM, that was probably the biggest protest. And me, being 24 years old, this is the biggest thing that has happened in South Korea. I definitely felt safe. I felt safe to the point where, I'm not afraid people was going to break into my house, my friends' businesses, or nothing like that.
Now, these two people that I interviewed, one was actually a father of a daughter who's now 16 years old, and 8 years back, he took his 8-year-old daughter at the time to rally against and for the impeachment of President at the time, Park Geun-hye. And that was because he remembers as a university student and as an elementary student what South Korea went through in order to get democracy. He knows the cost there. And he told me that he wants to teach his daughter what it takes for us to maintain this. And he feels that it's safe enough to take his whole family out to the streets this Saturday as well. And the second interview, as you heard, the Korean American who's only 24 years old, he just happened to be in Seoul at this time. But he told me he was deeply saddened to see this happen in the 21st century. And growing up in the States, his friends know how South Korea has valuable name and prestige as a cultural hub. We've been really getting our names off on the map, showing that we have cultural prominence and affinity there. But when his friends found out that a martial law decree was imposed, they worried, saying that is South Korea safe? But the essence of both of the interviewees was that South Korea's protests are safe. And as you could see from the last interview, he compared it to the Black Lives Matter movement back in the States. The amount of violence there isn't seen in Korea, which is why we could confidently say that demonstrations and rallies in Korea is just a critical part of our political DNA.
That's right. And it seems also like it's a family affair. I mean, the fathers bring the daughters out and really hoping that, rallies like this, remain safe. And also, some interestingly have pointed out that this time around the rallies are somewhat different, and because K-pop is involved. Tell us more about that.
I think it was interesting to see that instead of candlelights, as I mentioned before, which was a epitome of all the demonstrations back in 2016, 2017, this time around we saw candlelight sticks, actually light sticks, K-pop light sticks, and they filled the streets of downtown Seoul. Some people called the demonstrations looking like concerts rather than the typical rallies that we would be expecting. And I think this is a good indicator that the generation is getting younger and younger. And I actually had a conversation with my grandmother the past day about the ongoing rallies. And she told me it's not new to see student demonstrations because for her, it seems like in modern history in South Korea, they seem to be a turning point to when we see change. And student demonstrations is the heart of our democracy because we've seen it from the past, whether it was during colonial Japan, lots of students hit the streets to fight for our independence. During military dictatorship, we fought against tear gas and armed forces. And this time around, as we could tell from the father, even from a toddler all the way to your teens, families are going together. And now to see K-pop being involved with it, that means we're seeing an expansion of generation there. And K-pop is definitely bringing generations together. Now, I want to talk a bit more about the essence and the function of K-pop. But before we do so, let's actually hear from a protester herself who's also a K-pop fan.
기존 집회는 좀 약간 폭력적이고 사실 좀 많이 두려울 수 있는 이런 장벽을 응원봉이라는 곡을 그리고 K-팝이 이제 계속 흘러나오는 이런 K-팝들이 그 장벽을 많이 낮춰줬고 덕분에 다른 사람들도 연대의 개념으로 의미로 응원봉을 가지고 나와주신 것 같아요.
She specifically used the words K-pop has lowered the barrier for people to be out on these demonstrations. And a lot of people have been saying they seemed like concerts. And some of my international friends asked, is it fun to be going out to these demonstrations? Because by the looks of it, there's no tears. It's more of happiness, chanting. And it's not because the people are happy.
Also, no tear gas. So.
No tear gas, yes, for sure. But it's more of people know that they can vocalize their civil rights and what they want in a democracy in a safe environment. And I think that's worth noting. And a lot of student labor unions also participated. They've filed a lot of collective speeches. And you can see that the whole generation there, it ranges from the younger ones all the way to the older ones. And K-pop has definitely added a new element to it.
And there is this whole sense of community and camaraderie when the masses have all congregate at one point, isn't there?
Exactly. And I like the fact that you mentioned community because, as I said before, demonstrations and protests in South Korea are deeply embedded in our democratic or political DNA, I say. And I believe that South Korea, though a very homogenous country, we often see polarization, especially during these times when we're going through a lot of headlines and news talking about the National Assembly being polarized. We're demanding a leader to come down. So polarization is definitely there. But one thing that seems to be putting us together is our common ground for wanting democracy and our civil rights to be protected. And during the demonstrations this time around, a lot of people have been sharing the sense of communionship because on social media, some people offered to pay for the meals and snacks of protesters participating. So as you may see on the screen right now, these are actual social media posts of people offering to, or saying that they've already prepaid for 100 servings of kimchi stew.
Nice gesture, that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
or maybe energy drinks. And given the fact that though Singapore is quite hot, December is quite cold in Korea, and yet thousands are deciding to go out there. And some said, oh, my mom really wanted to go, but she's way too old to be going out right now. But instead, with a motherly heart, she wants everyone who's participating to at least have a very hearty, warm meal. So you can see the sense of community is definitely building up.
Yeah, and it's really hoping that even this weekend, the mass rally, it's going to be a safe affair. Thank you so very much, Grace, for stopping by. Always good to chat with you.
Thank you so much.
Well, we turn our attention to Syria now, where outgoing Prime Minister Mohammed al-Jalali has agreed to hand over the reins of the country after talks with the rebel leader Abu Muhammad al-Julani in Damascus. Now, the meeting comes just a day after rebels stormed the capital, the culmination of a 12-day lightning offensive that ousted President Bashar al-Assad. Opposition forces released a statement detailing the meeting between the Prime Minister and Julani, who is reportedly using his real name, Ahmed al-Shara. Both men reportedly discussed a transition of power to the rebel-led Salvation government. The rebels have also said they will grant amnesty to military personnel conscripted into service under Assad. Julani has promised an inclusive government and religious tolerance. He also says that the opposition administration will keep some of the previous government's practices.
دكتور هو في الشباب عندهم صار خبرة كثير عالية يعني بدأوا العمل من لا شيء يعني صحيح منطقة إدلب صغيرة وكذا بدون موارد بس يعني الحمد لله أحسن نعمل فيها شيء كثير كبير خلال الفترة الماضية فراح تشوف في خبرات يعني ما انه قضيه هي ما صفر يعني. ففي ملفات عندهم مستويات نجاح فيها عاليه يعني متفاوته يعني. مع ذلك نحن عندنا ما عندنا استغناء عن الحاله القديمه، ضروري نستفيد من وجودهم.
In the meantime, the U.S. is concerned the fall of the Assad regime could create a power vacuum in Syria, which the extremist group Islamic State could fill. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says that Washington is determined to prevent that, with American forces pounding ISIS targets in the country.
We have a strong interest in preventing the reemergence of ISIS, given the death and destruction that it's wrought for so long. We have a clear interest in ensuring that whatever weapons of mass destruction or components are left in Syria do not fall into the wrong hands. We have a clear interest in doing what we can to avoid the fragmentation of Syria, mass migrations from Syria, and, of course, the export of terrorism and extremism.
Mr. Blinken says the Biden administration welcomes claims by the rebel leader to form an inclusive government, but adds that the real measure will be in its commitment to do so, with the Syrian people having to choose their own future. Meantime, China, which has been deepening its engagement in the Middle East, has called for a political solution in Syria to restore stability.
叙利亚的前途和命运应当由叙利亚人民来决定。我们希望各相关方本着对叙利亚人民长远和根本利益负责的原则，尽快找到恢复稳定秩序的政治解决方案。
Observers say the fall of the Assad government creates some uncertainty for China, as it's heavily invested in Syria. Beijing established a strategic partnership with Damascus just last year when President Xi Jinping met Bashar al-Assad. Now, their economic ties have grown significantly in recent years, with Syria joining China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative in 2022. Coming up next on East Asia tonight, we delve into a silent crisis confronting the elderly in Taiwan after the death by apparent suicide of a renowned novelist. For those familiar with popular romance fictions, you might know the hit drama My Fair Princess or 还珠格格 from the late 1990s. Well, last week, its screenwriter and renowned Taiwanese writer Chong Yao died by suicide at her home. The 86-year-old was widely considered as the world's most popular Chinese-language romance novelist. Her death has shocked fans and sparked calls for Taiwanese society to pay greater attention to issues that may lead to rising suicide risk among the elderly. And for a deep dive into the issue, CNA's Victoria Jen joins us now from Taipei. And here's just a warning that some viewers might find this discussion distressing. So, Vic, I remembered growing up watching those movies, 还珠格格, a lot of these movies that was adapted from Chong Yao's books. But for those of our viewers who do not know about this renowned novelist, can you just tell us more about her as well as all her achievements?
Well, basically, if you ask anyone on the street now, almost everybody knows who Chong Yao was, and that's how famous she was. Born in China and later moved to Taiwan, Chong Yao started writing at the age of 18. And since then, she has published more than 60 novels, and almost all were bestsellers. Many were adapted into movies and TV series and remained popular for decades. And she was also a successful screenwriter and producer. One of her most famous works was the TV drama, as you mentioned, My Fair Princess, which launched the career of big name stars in Taiwan as well as China, like Ruby Lin and Zhao Wei. Her works has made her a household name in the Chinese-speaking world from the 1970s to 1990s. But even today, many young people in Taiwan and China know of her because of her contribution in the literary world. Telly?
Yes, so Victoria, even as famous as she is, do we know what made her decide to end her own life?
Well, Chong Yao was actually in good health when she made the decision to take her own life. It was widely speculated that she missed her late husband, a renowned publisher, who died in 2019, and she decided to follow his path. They were married for 40 years and were very much in love because of their shared passion in literature. Now, in an open letter on Facebook, Chongyao asked people not to feel sad for her, as she had gracefully left the world. She said she chose death to take control of the final major event in her life, rather than letting it be determined by fate or endure a slow decline. Chongyao explained that she wanted to avoid the painful process of weakness, decline, illness, hospital visits, treatments, and eventual futility, often seen in aging. She said that, and I quote, "I have witnessed such misery before, and I do not want that kind of death," unquote.
So, yeah, Victoria, I mean, she left this world on her own terms, How has the public reacted to that and all of what, she has described in her letter before she passed on?
Well, the news came as a big shock to the Chinese-speaking world, as many generations like yourself have grown up reading her novels. Many actors and actresses star in her films have expressed their sadness and condolences on social media. I spoke to some people on the streets, and here is what they have to say.
我10几岁就看他的小说了，看他们的电影了。我觉得那时候都让那个少女情怀啊做梦，以为有那种白马王子、那个公主，结果都是很梦幻的。
我觉得还蛮震撼的，因为小时候我记得，大概在我很小的时候，我爸就会带我去电影院看他的那些所谓的3厅电影。那他写的一些小说，我觉得也蛮感人的。那他也借由他的电影也培养出台湾一些蛮让大家怀念的女明星、男明星之类的。那我觉得比较震撼的是他这一次决定结束自己生命的方式。人的一生就是能够像琼瑶这样活过，已经算是非常不错了。因为他毕竟年纪也蛮大了，对，就80多岁了。
给了我们蛮多那种就是很美的，或者说很美好的一些爱情的一些童话故事这样子。那他于是我觉得蛮遗憾的，不过也祝福他老人家走好。
So, Vic, the fact that Chongyao took her own life at age 86, I mean, has that prompted concerns about challenges that elderly people in Taiwan face?
Well, the news about Chongyao's death by suicide has sparked concerns over the suicide rate among the elderly in Taiwan. Official data shows that people over the age of 65 have the highest suicide rate. Of course, there are many reasons that contribute to such tragedies. I spoke to an expert, and here is what she has to say.
在台湾，就是我们最近卫福部的那个自杀统计率，其实65岁以上的老年人，他的自杀率其实是不管是在就是人数啊，或者是他的所谓的那个自杀率的话，其实算是最高的。对，那所以但老人家其实大概有几个议题啦，哈，一个部分的议题可能就是他可能有一些精神疾病。好，比如说他有些忧郁症啊，或者是失智啊，好。那当然第二个部分就是因为身体老化之后，可能会有一些疾病的发生，或者是他可能身上有很多的病痛，老人就会觉得，老了好像人家就会说，我可能没有用啊，或者是什么记忆力越来越差，或者是可能人家对老人家的一些看法，可能会让他也会觉得说，他是不是开始没有一些所谓的生命价值等等哈。然后另外就是还有一些孤立感。对，有一些可能就是他可能是独居，比如说他的子女啊，就是在外工作啊。
So quite a few reasons there we heard. I mean, old age, frailty, dementia, maybe the family don't care about these elderly anymore. But I mean, what can a government do though to, address these issues?
Well, the government has clearly noticed the problem. In recent years, it has stepped up efforts in establishing agencies to help elderly to cope with their problems. In fact, it has set up more than 1,600 stations across Taiwan to provide assistance to the elderly for physical and mental support. The government has also encouraged the construction of more residential buildings in communities that are friendly to the senior citizens. But the fact that more and more elderly people are left to live on their own also makes it difficult for the government to reach out to them. Official data shows that more than 20% of the people over the age of 65 live alone. So clearly, more needs to be done to prevent such tragedies from happening.
Victoria, aging is a problem that is not just Taiwan's problem, but it's kind of across East Asian economies, right? I mean, we see South Korea and Japan, China. But help us understand then, what can we do? I mean, as individuals, how can we play our part?
It's an issue that affects many Taiwanese, especially since Taiwan is going to become a super-aged society next year, with 20% of its population aged over 65. So for people who have elderly parents or grandparents at home, they are urged to pay more attention to the behavior and mood of these senior citizens. Now, here's what the experts suggest.
比如说家里的老人家是不是会过度关注这个议题，或者是他会不会因为这个议题，他会有一些沮丧啊，或者是忧郁的状况出现？那这样的状况会不会一直持续下去？那如果还有这样的一个状况出现，我们当然就是要想办法，比如说让他去多接触人群啊，让他就是参加一些正常的一些社交啊。那当然，如果这些状况都一直持续下去的话，那我们就要想办法，他是不是要去看医生？如果大家可以做到的话，这段时间也许就是回家关心一下自己家里的老人家，可能带他去吃饭啊，或者是跟他有多一些的互动，让他可能得到被支持的这样的感觉。我觉得这个部分在我们这时候可以多做一点。
It's also very important for elderly to develop an interest or hobby that can occupy their time as well as their mind. My mother, for example, is 86 years old, and she's busier than I am now because she plays mahjong literally 7 days a week. It really helps her to train her brain and also keeps an active social life. So encouraging elderly to develop a hobby can really help improve the quality of their lives. And not necessarily mahjong, but there are other activities like gardening or like playing cards, anything. As long as they can occupy their minds and times, it would help. It would be very helpful.
Thanks so much for sharing stories about your mom as well. Appreciate that. CNA's Victoria Jen live from Taipei. Now, if you or someone you know requires emotional support, do reach out to your local agencies. And in Singapore, you can call these helplines. And that's East Asia Tonight this Tuesday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.